like to welcome you to our discussion. We're talking about replication, and on the surface, this is a discussion about what the Journal of Supply Chain Management is planning to do about replication, but I think it's a wider discussion about really replication as something that's important for the discipline and how we might approach it as scholars writ large. So what we're planning to do today is that we do have a formal presentation from Tom, Julia, Finn, and myself, and that formal presentation will be about the Journal of Supply Chain Management's plans and how we think we're going about this. But we've also invited the editors of other leading journals in the field to comment on our plans. So we've shared them with them in advance, and we've asked them to comment on those plans, both as scholars in the discipline and as editors. And we actually don't know what they're going to say, so they might tell us we're nuts, which would it might hurt the ego a little bit. But the point is that we want to have a discussion. And so the end point of this is really to have a discussion. So like I said, we do have formal material put together. It's about 20 minutes. That formal material, Tom will talk quickly about why we need to be doing replication, something that the discipline doesn't do. Finn will talk about, in essence, what replication is and the various forms of replication. Julia's going to talk about register reports and how the register report process can change the incentives, because I think one of the things Tom will talk about is the fact that currently there are no incentives to do replication. Whether or not it's important doesn't matter, there are no incentives to do it. So Julia's going to talk about register reports and how they can change the incentives. I'm going to talk about what we're proposing operationally at JSCM. And then, like I said, we've invited Beth, Rob, and Suzanne, and they're going in the order they said yes. So that's how we decided it. But they're going to quickly, in essence, start a conversation. So they're going to respond to what we shared with them. Again, hopefully say that we're not totally insane. And then we'll have an open discussion. And I can't imagine the formal material will take much more than half an hour. So with that, I will turn things over to Tom to talk about what replication is, why it matters.
Okay, so why replication? Well, in our discipline, there's never a perfect empirical paper, right? There's always competing explanations for any relationship that we might find. And in other disciplines, researchers are finding that even some of the, the sort of bedrock replication or bedrock findings that they've kind of taken to the bank for years can't be replicated, right? And that kind of suggests that those competing explanations carry the day, more than we might like to think. There's always many threats to validity in any paper, right? We know that, and we can never eliminate them all with any kind of certainty. But the more studies we have, the more sort of certainty that we create around a particular finding. But in our field, we tend to have multiple papers looking at the same broad research question, but it's really not very systematic, as Mark pointed out back in his JOM editorial, probably close to a year ago now. We tend to vary everything really from study to study. We have different samples, different contexts, different measures, everything is typically different from paper to paper. And we can generate a lot more certainty if we had a little bit more systematic approach, and replication is one way to do that. And beyond threats to validity, our economy has changed a lot over time. We're not studying, fungi or the human brain or things like that don't vary much with time, right? And, some of our findings are 30, 40 years old or more. And if for no other reason to do replication, things have changed, right? And it's time to go back and kind of revalidate some of that stuff. So, so why don't we do more replication if it's so important? I think most of us know it's important. That's why we're here. Well, got to kind of look at the payoffs. If we think about kind of the ROI, the investment, any study is a lot of work, right? The more we do them, the more we kind of realize that. The payoffs really differ though. The payoffs are influenced by reviewer attitudes and AE attitudes and editor attitudes and things like that. And attitudes towards replication research and supply chain, aren't super positive. We hear that there's not enough originality, things like that. Even if we just try to replicate certain aspects of a study. The payoffs are also influenced by the findings, and disconfirming received knowledge is not always as welcome as confirming received knowledge. And if we're replicating, there's a pretty good chance we're going to disconfirm something, right? So these two factors, attitudes and findings, make replication kind of a risky proposition under the current incentive structure. And so what we aim to do is tweak the incentive structure a little bit. So with that, I'll turn it over to Finn and Julia and Mark to talk about how we're going to do that.
Yeah, so thanks, Tom, for the introduction. And let me talk a few minutes about multiple forms of replication, because there's lots of different terminologies going around. So it might be helpful to clarify a little bit the scope and the terminology that we seek to target. First of all, let me say that we're not looking at reproduction. Reproduction is really the reanalysis of the same data. That could be very useful as well. That could also help improve the quality of our work, but we are really focusing on replication, so retest of earlier hypotheses. So the minimum ingredient that we're actually seeking to encourage is the retest of a single hypothesis. It doesn't need to be the retest or the replication of a full study, okay? Another point is that we just want to emphasize that want to encourage replication through this initiative. And we're not aiming for replicability per se, okay? I think that's a kind of open door almost, but we do want to emphasize that. As I said earlier, there's many different labels in use for overlapping forms of replication. So I'll just use a little bit of a discussion that has, or terminology that has been used by people like Tina Köhler and Jose Cortina in a recent working paper. And one of the first dimensions they have actually looked at is the source of error variance, okay, or the source of variability that one wants to evaluate. And some people actually talk about replicability or replication studies only in the narrow sense as studies that look at the methodological moderator. So the replication is really in the methodology. That's not just our scope. We want to expand it also to replication in a broader sense. And some people refer to that as the generalization or the generalizability of earlier studies. And then we're really into the substantive moderators. And another discussion that is typically addressed is literal versus replications with extensions. We're welcoming replications with extensions as well, and sometimes we would be welcoming literal replications. So more than, let's say, the degree of difference with your original study, what is important is really to what extent the differences are really carefully argued for, okay? And the authors that I mentioned earlier, Köhler and Cortina, they looked at 400 replication studies in management journals, and they actually found that a lot of the existing replications are not that well argued for. They're what they sometimes call quasi-random or regressive. So they're not really improvements compared to the original studies. And if there is a replication, it's kind of informal or not very well argued. Okay, so the really constructive replications are still a minority, even if the number of replications are growing in different fields. So we're really looking for constructive replications, whether that's literal, whether that's with extension, whether that's on methodological aspects, or whether that's on substantive aspects. Another dimension that typically is invoked is the level of researcher independence. Is the original researcher involved in the new study or not? We're encouraging or welcoming all kinds of replications in that sense, both dependent, where the original researcher is involved, and independent and anything in between. So next slide, please. Yeah, so that concludes my part.
So with that in mind, so we heard from Finn and Tom that we have quite a challenge here. So these studies involve a very profound argumentation for the contribution, the novelty, and at the same time, there is a higher risk of getting this type of research published because it builds on prior research. Yeah, so there is a chance that this does not work out. And therefore, one might wonder, why should you be crazy enough to do such a replication study? And therefore, we decided together to turn to a different type of working with manuscripts and to recur to the so-called registered reports. What are registered reports in the first place? Well, they are a very specific publishing format where you change something to the way in which the peer review process is handled. Basically, what you would need to do is you would have to provide a very detailed outline of your research plans. These would need to include everything that Tom and Finn just mentioned. So in particular, what is the study that you wish to replicate? And how do you think will this replication generate novel knowledge and contribute something to the generalizability, for example? How would you like to collect the data, and so on and so forth? And this proposal will then be subject to a peer review process. And once this is accepted, you can actually go out and collect the data and finish the type of research. So in a sense, this way of working with a manuscript in the form of registered reports changes something to the incentive structure of working with replications. So whereas you might wonder from what you have heard so far, why should you do this? The fact that we would like to introduce registered report to JSCM at the same time should give you some security and encourage you to actually do this type of research. So what do they do? Because you actually get feedback whether or not your plan is accepted by the journal or not, you get very early in the review process security about whether or not this appears to be publishable. So this does away with some of the disadvantages of what Tom actually mentioned previously about replication studies. You, at the same time, have a clear plan of what you then need to do as in response to this first initial acceptance, or actually rejection, that can happen as well. But you have some security before you actually do the large part of the work, namely the data collection per se. And then once you are finished with your study, once you have executed it, it will be very likely that it will also be accepted, and Mark will probably elaborate on the few instances where this might not be the case, but you actually have quite a lot of security early onward. So these are the registered reports. They work such that you submit it, and once you get an acceptance, you would actually register it, your plan of the study, with the Center for Open Science. And with that, I would like to hand over again to Mark.
Okay, thank you. So in essence, I'm just going to say what the previous three speakers said, but in a different format and put it all together. So Our plan is to encourage replications using the register report process, which means that the review process becomes a two-stage review process. The first stage is going to be the stage that I guess, from an author standpoint, the bar is higher or harder, if you will. And I think about this a lot from the standpoint of it's very much like a PhD process where, various schools call it different things, but at some point in the process, you have to turn in and defend a proposal. This is what I am going to do. And then you go do it. Stage one is your proposal defense, in essence. So in stage one, like any other paper, the paper submitted, the editors will do their due diligence, and assuming we decide to send the paper out, it'll be sent to a select group of AEs. In this case, the AEs have all volunteered to handle replication papers, and Tom, Julie, and Finn would be the first three on that list of volunteers, but there are a few others, and to reviewers who will have also volunteer to engage in the process. And when they're doing that review, that first stage review is really asking two questions, or two broad questions. The first is the study you're proposing to replicate, worth isn't maybe the word I'm looking for, but can it make a contribution? And we would expect, two kind of broad categories here. Now, obviously there are other possibilities, but the two broad categories we would expect to see would be people who are proposing to replicate, as Tom was noting, maybe this is a seminal study, but maybe it's also 30 years old. And 30 years ago, our expectations methodologically were different, and 30 years ago, the global economy was different. And hence, depending on results from 30 years ago to still apply today is an iffy proposition. And so we would expect that would be one category we'd see. What we also hope to see, especially, are where people say, hey, this is something that was done recently, maybe very recently, but maybe it was also done in a limited context, a single industry study, very narrow in terms of maybe a small country did in Ireland or something like that, right? Something of that nature where if the results held in a much more global context, they would have serious implications for the discipline, but we need a bigger study. So those would be kind of the two big things we'd be expecting to see. Obviously, there are other possibilities. So that's part one, why is it worth replicating this paper? The second half is how are you going to do it? And this, I think, especially at the beginning, is where the register report process is going to be, I don't know, tricky is not the right word, but this is where I'm expecting it to take a lot of time, because we're not used to, as authors, having to defend what we plan to do, especially from the standpoint of, what if you don't find the same thing as the original authors, right? That this is something there are a lot of potential alternative explanations for your results. And when you're doing a replication, you have to consider that. And so Tom started, he said, well, we do these studies with the same research question, but we change everything. When we change the context, the methods, the sample, right? And when we change all those things, each of those things is an alternative explanation. If you're going to do a proper replication, you have to do it in a manner where you can address all of those possibilities if you don't find what the previous authors found, which is potentially, I don't think it's any more complicated than designing a good study in general, but it requires a lot of thought, and perhaps thought that we're not necessarily used to doing. So I would be expecting that that's where, especially the first few papers that go through the process, that's where they take a lot of time. But the good news is that we'd be asking you to revise your research design before you collected the data. In other words, this is not a fatal flaw that rejects your paper. It's a discussion about how could we do this better. Now, once we get to the point where the paper is accepted in principle, and I think that's an important term. Accepted in principle means we plan to publish this thing unless something goes horribly wrong. Once it's accepted in principle, we're going to ask authors to post or publish, if you prefer, the register report. And there are a lot of repositories out there, but we're going to use the Open Science Repository, because it seems to be kind of the best known and the best run, but there are other options. So that would be stage one. When we get to the second stage, the review should be much narrower, right? So the second stage review is the full paper, which is normally where we spend lots of time, but in the second stage review, we are going to send it back to reviewers, but their remit now becomes much narrower because the front end of the paper has in essence already been accepted. Sure, you might have to tweak a few things and so on, but that's not up for discussion, right? We've already said the research question matters, the research design is robust. So what we're now looking for in the second stage review is, first and foremost, was the empirical design executed as proposed? If the answer is yes, your paper is being published. If the answer is no, and there's a good reason, our sample size is bigger than expected. Well, obviously we're going to be happy with that, right? But if it's smaller than expected, but we proposed 500, we got 480. The world probably is fine with that, right? But assuming your empirical design is executed as expected, the paper is going to get published. That does not mean that there may not be revisions, because there are two other questions the reviewers are going to be asking. One is, do your results match your conclusions? And we ask that always as reviewers, but we can especially see in this type of paper where that could be, might require some rewriting. Like, I'm imagining authors who replicate very seminal papers and they find out that those papers don't stand up to a retest, and they don't want to say the original paper was wrong, because they're afraid of somehow insulting a more senior scholar, right? I mean, that's going to have to be addressed. Equally, that there's the possibility that just the paper's not written to maximize its results. So there can certainly be revisions in this process, but assuming you execute the design as intended, the revision should really be about making the paper stronger and better and increasing its impact. So we would expect that 99 out of 100 papers that get through the first stage will get through the second stage. It should be a really rare occurrence for these papers not to get published. And we'll have a whole lot to do with not being able to execute the design, not being able to finish the paper. So in essence, that's what we're planning to do, right? Replication is important. It's something we should do, but the reality is our current incentive system discourages it instead of encourages it. We think that using register reports is a way to change the incentives. And we're planning to publish an editorial that captures all this, but we purposely didn't publish the editorial yet. And the reason for not publishing the editorial yet was that we wanted to get feedback from the community to see, and I'm going to suggest that we're doing this, but we may not be doing it the right way, or we may have missed really important things that need to be captured in that editorial. So one of the reasons for having this conversation, we've had a few others as well, is to really make sure that we're not missing anything, right? And make sure that we do this as best that we can. So to get that conversation started, like I said, we invited the editors of 3 other journals to talk both as scholars and editors. And then after they're done, we'll open this up to everybody. So I would suggest at this point, Julia, kill the slides, and Beth, if you'd like to tell the world how crazy we are, I'd love to hear it.
I appreciate the invitation, and I will. I won't tell you all you're crazy. I actually really appreciate what you all are taking on. And I'll be quite honest, I haven't really given a lot of thought to replication until I read Mark, your JOM, because it's not something we do in this field. And I think we all are inherently used to saying, well, if it's not new and not novel and not interesting, then it doesn't make a contribution. So I really appreciate that you are bringing this you're bringing this forward. And I think what you have done in terms of the registered reports, when you were talking about it, and my thought was, this does sound like my dissertation defense. This reminds me of the old dissertation defense where you did the 5 chapters. And I think that's going to be key, because this is risky. This is risky for anybody to take on. And so I think that's going to be important. The only issue, there are a couple things just in reading the Mark, your paper about it, and reading a little bit more about the presentation. I think it makes, my first thought were the seminal studies. So I was trained on the old in my PhD program, we read a lot of the seminal studies in marketing on buyer-supplier relationships. So I think replicating those studies makes a lot of sense. I think it would be fascinating because the world has changed. I am a little more iffy about the more recent publications and just changing the context. That one I'm not sure about. Maybe if I saw one, it would make more sense. And the only other thing that I that I looked at in a couple of the examples that you gave, the only thing I would worry about is how much are these going to be cited if they're published. I went back to, there was one that you mentioned, it was a 2013 replication, and I don't have, it was Zhang, and it was, so I just looked at the sites. And so 2013, this replication paper got 68 sites. I went back to the original, which was Hendricks and Single, and it had over 1,300 sites, and it had more sites in the last year than the replication study did. Because I think people want the seminal papers. So that would be my only other comment about the risk of as an author too of taking on these replication studies. That's all I got.
Thank you very much, Beth. And as Finn noted in the chat box, we have put together a bunch of materials on replication, both previous publications, and we've also interviewed a bunch of people in the field. Our criteria for who we interviewed were AOM distinguished scholars and Uroma fellows, but basically asking them what they would replicate. And to Beth's point, most of them talked about old research, but not all of them. Some of them talked about more recent papers and why. So the will they be cited issue, I have no good answer to. Rob, you want to add to that? I think you're going to probably say the same thing about that.
Well, yeah, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be part of the session today. I think this is an important topic. I think it's also a challenging topic to figure out how best to both advance the field, but add increasing rigor to the field too. So let me, I just have a few comments, so let me kind of parse them into two buckets. The first really focus on my impressions as a scholar, and then I'll just have a couple of comments from IJOPM's perspective, because we did discuss it as an editorial team as well. First, just in terms of kind of reflections for the field, I think that what I might suggest is that, first of all, there's maybe a third category of replication. You have disconfirm and confirm. And in fact, I think the confirm is relatively straightforward. Now, whether it's cited, to be fair to Beth, I think is an open question going forward. But the disconfirm, I think, first of all, the challenge there is for authors then to explain why. And if there is no ability to, or I assume there'll be effort, but if there's no clarity on why disconfirmatory results occurred, I think it may not resolve anything. Maybe it's the intent then is simply to feed more research in the question, and that's okay. I think then in that case, that probably will be cited as the field moves forward. But I do think that as authors propose replication, I think that there's the need to propose some deeper mechanistic understanding as part of that replication. To simply say, we're looking at A influencing B without adding something that allows us to tease apart what happens if it disconfirms. Do we at least have one mechanism we can point to? Even if it doesn't work out, at least we proposed a mechanism, an alternative mechanism, then I think, that would be valuable replication. The other piece, though, is what happens if there's no results. So disconfirm, I use the old hypothesis testing, right? You reject the hypothesis, but it's very hard. And if you get the same results, ideally, that's confirmatory. But unfortunately, many times, and I'm thinking in a regression sense, you don't get a statistically significant coefficient, for example. Is that confirming or disconfirming? Essentially, that kind of ends up being a bit of a wash. And so then you're stuck saying I can neither confirm nor deny, the prior work. And I think that particular outcome is probably the most challenging one to address. And you can argue it's lack of power in the sample. It's a different context. You're really just left speculating very broadly about what might happen. And so I don't have an answer for that one, but I think it is worth at least debating how that type of outcome might be handled. And maybe it's okay to simply say, we did what we said we'd do. We don't have anything strong to say because there's no statistical significance. But maybe that's okay too. So I'm not sure I have a strong position on that one, but I think it is a risk as we sort of think through it. The last piece that struck me about replication is that there is an increasing push among journals now, and it's more with the large sample archival data, econometrics type studies, where there's push now for robustness checks. And I think in a sense, we are attempting as a field, I think it's a good thing, we are attempting as a field to do replication. It's not quite replication, to be fair. I understand there's a difference, but we are attempting to at least check the validity, which is one of the functions of replication. And so, I do applaud the work of many authors to increase the ability to sort of say that we have done a series of robustness checks, and reviewers are often pretty quick to add a few on top of that. That you need to work through as well. But I think as a field, we are building some more rigor into what we do that may in the future force us to think more creatively about what replication is. And that I think is also a good thing as a field to discuss as we move forward. The last thing I'll kind of talk about is just from an IJOPM perspective. So now a little more narrowly just on a journal sense. I know we do have a different scope in terms of the research that we publish relative to JSCM, and it's just a factual difference. But having said that, we talked a little bit about it as an editorial team and thought that there's value in doing this. It's an area that's probably neglected, but certainly under pursued. And so what we're looking at really is maybe taking a little different tack to it. I definitely like the process outlined that you had on the previous slide, Mark, where there's a stepwise sort of flow diagram that everybody understands, and it's clear what will happen at each step. And so we do value that type of process. I think that process makes a lot of sense. The difference might be at the very front end of the process where you have noted, basically authors propose, just like a dissertation candidate might, and say, here's what we'd like to do. We're actually thinking of maybe turning that the other way around and say, here's the top 10 topics or papers that we might see the most value in replicating, and invite an open-ended proposal. So it doesn't have to come in the next month or even year, but sort of leave those out there. It's similar to some other fields where they have sort of the top, puzzles or, difficult questions we want answered. And it's just left out as an open challenge to the field to pursue research. And whether somebody takes it up at some point as part of a dissertation, or otherwise within their career as it develops. It's fine. So we haven't got that far. So I will simply say it's an idea in process. But I certainly am very supportive of moving in this direction personally. And as a journal, we're just trying to figure out how we might fit into working through this as well. And so it's still a work in process for us.
Thank you very much, Rob. Suzanne?
Thank you for inviting me to be part of this fascinating discussion. Thank you again, Mark, for the piece that you published at JOM, which is leading the field to have discussions that we really need to be having. Because it all comes down to what we know and how well we know it and what kind of knowledge it is. So Mark, as you were talking, and as I was looking at the draft that I have of your editorial, I was thinking about the fact that we work with two different types of knowledge. We've got the knowledge that comes out of natural science, and we have the knowledge that comes out of more the science of the artificial, and a lot of what we do, so we actually would love to be doing natural science, but most of the time we're not. Most of the time we're involved with the sciences of the artificial, which is about recipes, making things, trying to do it better. And so when we're looking at natural science, then we are making truth claims. We're trying to figure stuff out. So somebody did a study, I just happened to be listening to a podcast today that said, so we know that if you lose muscle mass as you age, then that's bad for all-cause mortality. And we also know that if you lose muscle strength, that's bad. And so these are, two things that have been studied. You can do epidemiology. You can try to design something probably with animal studies. But then the question, so that leads us to the question of, well, if you have to choose between maintaining the size of the muscle or the strength, which matters more in terms of all-cause mortality? And this is the type of thing that I think you were getting at, Mark, in your JOM forum piece, that as we go on to ask the next question, how can we fill in the gaps? Because if we as a field think about, it's not just, I'm the only one on the soccer field and I'm going to try to kick the ball in the goal, but how can we come together to make actionable knowledge that somebody cares about, that causes us to, help people make decisions that are more sustainable, more competitive, more profitable, create better jobs, support innovation. This is what we need to be doing, which means we all need to bring our small pieces. Some of these will be more cited than others. You know what? If we keep all pulling together and doing stuff that somebody cares about, sooner or later enough stuff is going to get cited that we're going to be good. So that we need to be looking at, okay, so we kind of know this, but even if it was a slam dunk study, there are all kinds of things that can lead us astray. So we have got to be relentless at figuring this out. Now, I also want to come back to what Rob said about disconfirm, confirm. When you go and you set up a study and you're pretty sure that you should be finding the same thing and you don't find anything, this we feel is a valid result. And when you look at what's happening in biology and in medicine, then those studies are published and they get pulled together, and then you've got meta-analyses, et cetera. So it is part of, not everybody's kicking the ball toward the goal, and it's part of being a team. But Rob, also what you made me think of is, so at JOM, we have been incubating papers that do what we call intervention-based research, because we are realizing that when we put together our theory and our recipes, we come in and we say, if we do this, this is going to make things better in this way, and this is what we expect is going to happen. And sometimes it actually happens. A lot of the time you end up with a, what? No way. Result. And you end up with that no way result for very surprising reasons, which is why at JOM we talk a lot about abductive logic. So that rather than just we made a knowledge claim, we went to test the knowledge claim, true, false. We're really trying to figure out, because we're dealing with complex systems. Our systems are not as complex as biology, but they're complex enough to really mess with our minds. Now I also want to come to this question of key questions. So I thought that Rob had a great idea about like just pulling together what are the questions that need to be asked. Well, one of the things we've been doing with ASCM is just keeping an ear out, doing occasional surveys. ASCM is actually quite excited about this question of having people weigh in on what are the things they would like to know more about. Now, what we've discovered is that the things that these people who would be acting on our research want to know about don't come in anything that can be tested. Real high level, using very imprecise language. So somehow over the next 10, 15 years, we need to be working together with practitioners so that we can actually do science. But asking those questions has been interesting, although much more frustrating than anybody would have expected. One of the things that we found works pretty well is coming up with forum pieces. So we take ideas. We did something like this recently with lean production, and a good time has been had by all. So we bring in Wally Hopp, who comes in and says, it's been quite a few decades. Nobody really still has a sense we know what we're talking about. And so I'm just going to go out and take a shot at it. And I'm senior enough that people can react, and I'll just thank them for their input. And then we had quite a few people come in and write extensive responses that were passionate. And then that got Tyson and me involved, coming back to saying, we haven't defined these terms well enough. Let's clean up our act. And so that's been great. So that publishing a forum piece, because you might think, well, I know this isn't interesting. This would be something that would be useful to know. But when you have a senior person who comes and says, this is the way I think it works, you create all, kind of a nice habitat for young scholars to come and say, such and such senior said this needs to be done, so I'm going to do it. Now, if we combine that with this whole idea of agreeing on the study design and going forward. So Dan Guide was talking about that from the day that he came in as co-EIC at JOM. And we have continued to do that. And we've been paying a lot of attention to what the Journal of Development Economics is doing, because they've been doing, very successfully for a couple of decades, signing off on the research design. And that's worked very well. And it has given JDE a unique role in the whole field of economics. That means that they have a voice, and we're so much like, right, is it cited, or is it, like, what's the impact factor? And but what the reason why we do what we do is to have a voice and change things and have them go better. And so that what I observe is this has given JDE a voice. Now, an interesting thing arises. So what happens if, and we have a special issue for proposals that is going to be announced momentarily. Rogelio Oliva, Brad Stratz, and Aravind Chandrasekaran are going to be the guest editors on that. And we've gone through about 37 iterations, and it will soon be announced. So this is, we all need to be doing this. We all, and Mark and Tyson and I have been exchanging messages about how do we get Wiley to do this? Because if we're all doing this, the field is going to learn more interesting stuff. And by the way, our research questions are more likely to interest somebody aside from, just barely us. So anyway, let's suppose that somebody submits a nicely designed study, and people say, oh yes, okay, we'll buy off on this. And then they go, JOM's good, but I get more credit for tenure at management science. And that's just what my school is like. So now that you've approved this, then I'm going to take it and, submit it to management science. We're like, fine, because we have established that JOM and JSCM can do the same because, we've got strong empiricists. We have put our mark of approval on this piece of research. And if it gets published in management science, then it is, yeah. So I got the help from JOM, and then, the study was published in management science, but then it's up to us. And I think that, all of our journals really invest in the author experience, the support to say, so if you would like to stay at JSCM, or if you'd like to stay at JOM with the paper, we're on your side. And then it ends up, we as a field are doing good research. So these are the conversations that we are having. I could go on for another 30 minutes, but I'll hold myself back.
All right, cool. So we have totally failed at our promise to deliver in half an hour or so. Somehow I'm not surprised. So at this point, I'd love to hear from some of the other people who are here, especially about some of the issues that were raised by the discussants, whether it should just be seminal studies, what do we do with null results? Those were two of the things that came up. I'll be honest, my view on the cited thing is who cares? I'm kind of with Suzanne on it, that's not why we publish papers, but it is, perhaps the deeper question is, is it of value, even if it's not cited? Because read and cited are different things. So it'd be great to hear from people in the room, and I think the room is small enough that, no need to use the chat box. Open your mic and have at it. Scott?
I don't know if there's a protocol here for raising your hand or not, or let's see, can I put my hand down? Yeah, looks like I can. Having just gone through semesters where you had to do the Zoom thing, it is glorious to not have to do this every single class session. So, so here's a question that I have about this is, it's interesting that this discussion is really taking on an operation supply chain bent here. I love the fact, Mark, that you brought in a flow chart, that's what we do.
That was Tom's doing.
Yeah, that's what we do. So, however, the question that I wonder about, as I'm thinking through this, and I actually think there's a lot of potential in this, but one thing that Beth's revealed, and I was not aware of, is your PhD in marketing? You're muted.
Yeah, so I'm in my PhD program was a supply chain marketing department. So I am very heavily influenced by marketing. How about that?
All right. So as is mine.
Flow charts.
Yeah. So here's what I think is that Suzanne's comment about, we want to have a voice here is, who is the target market? So if we could put on a marketing hat and think about who is going to do a replication study. Now, and I can think back to things like 25 years ago, I was sitting in a meeting similar to this, and we're talking about doing more, cross-disciplinary research. But then we started to say, well, wait a second, if you don't have tenure, don't do it, too risky. So when I think about these replication studies, who do we want? Who is the target market that we would encourage to do a replication study? Would it be somebody pre-tenure? Probably not, just because people keep mentioning this word risk. And for people that are pre-tenure, they need to take a little more conservative bent. Now, would it be senior people, old people, gray hair like me? Are we the ones that would do replication studies? If we did, it'd probably be replicating our own stuff, because we've been, we're kind of, I don't know, has-beens and some, our greatest stuff often was 20 years ago or something like that. But Would it be mid-career people? You know, I guess one thing I like to do is think about this. Now, here's a thought that I think about who I think could really benefit by doing replication studies. The advantage of a replication study is that in some sense, it's riskier in terms of impact and publication. So therefore, you know, the registered reports and so forth. But in another sense, is less risky because it's taking it's a proven path. It's a path that somebody has already verified as being an interesting research question, and we're studying that again. I wonder if possibly an ideal target market for doing replication studies is students who are still in their PhD programs. Meaning, I would wonder if this could be a rite of passage, that if you're in a PhD program, one thing that we might expect of our students is to do a replication study of some seminal work from 20, 30 years ago, and thereby show that you have good methodology, that you can actually repeat something in a rigorous way. Now, the disadvantage of that is there's less creativity, because replication studies are taking a lot of the creative element that the prior researcher used, but that will come in the dissertation. So I'm almost thinking of a replication study, and people keep referring to this as it's just like we do in a dissertation. Why not have replication studies be somehow integrated with preparation for a dissertation? And if we did this, perhaps in the journal, there might be, and I was thinking about the thing that was mentioned yesterday, that there's JSCM has a junior editorial review board that's chaired by my colleague, Becky Brow, who, by the way, is from the Brigham Young University, not the University of Utah. They are our enemy. They are our arch rival. We beat them in football last week, and I want to leave it at that. But Becky Brow and Henrik Frank they're chairing this junior editorial review board. Maybe that could be given as a charge to that junior editorial review board, is to help manage a process of replication studies. And then perhaps we can encourage new doctoral students to, as part of their first few years of training, do a replication study. So anyway, that's just a few thoughts. But what I'm suggesting is, in order for this to be successful, it's not enough to have a great process. We also have to have the right target market. That's all.
Finn, I have a feeling you were about to say the same thing Scott was, but.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to respond very briefly to that. I think it's a fair comment to make, Scott. I think part of what how we're trying to make it more attractive generally is indeed this combination with the pre-registration. I think that's a neat feature that both have been used obviously in many different ways, but really combining them in this way, as we're suggesting, I think helps make it attractive to a broad range of people. But yeah, there will be some categories I think that are more prone and perhaps more interested. And surely PhD students could be one group, and senior scholars with tenure could be another group. So the other way we've really tried to make this more concrete and more appealing is indeed by listing that kind of a challenge or candidates that also Rob was calling for through these interviews, and there will be more interviews added as we move forward.
So could I ask a question about that, Finn? You mentioned that, and one of the things I asked yesterday, and Mark gave an answer to that, but I would wonder, and I really like Suzanne's comment about, going out and asking people, what are you interested in? Being market driven, heaven forbid, that we would actually be pull in our research, is special issues. And I'm not saying even an entire special issue, but maybe, as Suzanne mentioned, do a survey and find out what leading scholars think is the best thing to replicate. And then having a call saying, we're looking for proposals to do a replication study for this, and it's competitive, and maybe people, might put in their proposals. You might have an issue that has 2 or 3 papers that are replication studies of the same single paper. That could be very interesting to say, we're going to look at this seminal paper from a few different angles here and really build, as Suzanne mentioned, this idea of building things that are very having a voice, that were really impactful type of research. But again, I think this idea of having a special issue and having it be kind of a competitive thing where people really want to be part of this because it's going to be, academically prestigious here, might have some value.
All right, thanks, Scott and Finn. Other comments, questions? Suzanne, go ahead.
So one thing that came to my mind as I've been listening to this very interesting conversation is the first time I really thought about replication was when I was writing a paper about flexibility. And there was this seminal work that said that when there's uncertainty, decision makers that invest in flexibility do better. And it was established as being true. We start with something that appears to be true, conventional wisdom, and then these authors did a study and they said, this is true. And Mark Pagel, together with Krauss, came and said, you know what? We checked this out, and what we discovered was that it's not true, that you don't have, this causal relationship is not something that we can assume. And I was like, that's interesting. And that paper fundamentally changed where I took my 2004 paper. And that paper came out in 2004. So basically it showed up and it changed. It really gave me a lot of traction in what I was doing. So Mark, I'm curious, what made you decide to go, because everybody thought that other, there was new Sewell and
Swamidass and Newell.
Swamidass and Newell, thank you. So everybody thought that was just absolutely true, like so true, it was completely uninteresting. What made you go there?
Scott, you'll like the answer to this. So actually, we went there twice because we did a first replication in 1999 that was from my dissertation. And what actually happened was that part of my dissertation basically said this relationship is true. And one of the people on my dissertation committee was not a supply chain scholar. They were from OB, and they said, I think that you better verify that given the way you're doing your dissertation, because I don't think it's true. And so I had the pleasure, if you will, of being asked to do an additional pre-study as part of my dissertation. And the process of doing that pre-study suggested that this seminal paper was not necessarily correct. And having replicated it once and nobody paid any attention when we did it in 1999, we did it a second time in 2004. I'm not sure anyone paid any attention the second time except you, Suzanne. So it's good to increase the audience to one. But yeah, so it did start with the dissertation, that there was a piece of the dissertation that was kind of hanging on an assumption that we all believe this is true. And it was based on, and in fairness to Swamidass and Newell, what was rigorous research, especially survey research in 1987, when, 999 out of 1,000 people in the field were only doing math models. They were learning as they went, but it did not stand up in our retest. But yeah, it started with the dissertation. And in my mind, that is probably, to me, it strikes me as a really good first study for a PhD student to do. That as Scott said, the research questions kind of laid out, and they can work on the research design chops, and they can build it into their dissertation, and then they can expand on it. I assume they would choose to replicate something they thought was going to build into their dissertation. Other questions or comments? Nobody's told us we're nuts. The biggest concern seems to be citations, which I think we're willing to risk. I think the null results thing is interesting. And Eric, maybe you can help here, because I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about this issue from maybe a different perspective, but my read of the psychology and medicine literature is they treat no results as disconfirming in a lot of cases. Is that correct? In other words, when they go back and retest, that a lot of the discussion of the replication crisis comes down to the fact that what was originally found as significant does not come back as significant when retested. Is that a fair description? Sorry to put you on the spot, but.
And I have to admit that I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, I was thinking you would.
Maybe as a fellow RSM colleague, I can jump in. I think it's an interesting discussion indeed that Rob put up. My personal view is that I would like to focus more on effect sizes rather than just, let's say, a kind of dichotomous disconfirming, confirming discussion. I think what hopefully is the contribution in the end is that we get more and more studies and more effect sizes, which we then can use also in meta-analysis. Okay. And so that is for one particular types of studies and very useful. But I think that is more the perspective that I would take. So the whole idea is to create a larger body of empirical studies where we can hopefully really, as precisely as possible, explain possible variations in effect sizes. But that it's not just about confirming or disconfirming earlier or the seminal studies.
Yeah, and to build on that, I think one of the things that has to be part of this process is that those proposals have to, one of the more fundamental questions is going to be, do you have enough power? Right, that it's not going to get through the first stage review if power is potential alternative explanation. That's one of the things that I think we can all catch. It's not nuance; it's kind of a key component of this. So it is highly conceivable that they get null results or complete disconfirm, they get the opposite relationship, but the power should be significantly more in the retest than the original test. So hopefully that reduces that issue a bit, but it still doesn't go away. Other questions, comments? Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one question that maybe is unasked, and maybe there's an assumed answer that one could have, but much of the conversation has focused on, or at least my impression of much of the conversation has focused more on studies where there's a survey or some sort of empirical data set that one can point to. Clearly, much of our knowledge movement forward has been on case-based research. And what would a replication study look like in a case-based context? And I think it should be done. So I think we need to wrestle with the problem. But that, I think, is less clear because often often the original study was done based on maybe a snowballing sort of methodology or other sorts of access that you can't directly replicate, which is fine. But then how would I translate that to a new topic or to the same topic, but now it looks like it's simply just a different setting, which didn't match well, I think, with your initial criteria. So I think this would be something maybe worthy of further discussion is, what would it look like when the original study was cast in methodology A versus cast in methodology B? Or does it matter? I mean, is it simply that it should be done with a different methodology too? Would that count as replication? So anyways, just some thoughts.
I'm gonna answer, but I want help because my read of most of the discussions of replication is that typically it's limited to theory testing research, that doing a replication of casework where the sample is, not only non-random, but it's so unique to that specific study that that's always going to be an alternative explanation that you can't eliminate. So typically when you see discussions of replication, it is of hypothesis testing / theory testing research. So that would be my short answer. I saw somebody else's hand. Suzanne, you want to?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So the way that we've approached that at JOM is to say that with cases, you're not making generalizations, you're not making truth claims, you're more trying to figure out what are the interesting questions. If we go back to, say, mouse models or epidemiology, they don't tell you what is true. They tell you where you should be investing in terms of your clinical trials. So that I would suggest that the insights that we get from cases don't so much lead to something that would be replicated, but it would more lead to to data collection and exactly the type of studies that you all at JSCM are calling for and that we at JOM are calling for in a slightly different way. Also, the whole idea of intervention-based research, when our knowledge comes in the form of a recipe, then the best thing that you do is cook and see if you put in too much salt or if it didn't hold together. But really great question.
I think it's fair indeed, Rob, that to say that the implicit setting is indeed mostly theory testing studies, surveys, archival data, etc. I think in principle, people also beyond our field say that case studies could also be replicated in different ways. Also because there are some methods that also suggest that you can use case studies to test theory. Okay, so for instance, necessary condition analysis, etc. But I think our key focus for now is really more on let's say traditional theory testing, large scale studies. But in principle, I would be open also to other forms of replication.
I don't want to put words in my co-editor's mouth, but I think we hope to be surprised by what people propose. Surprised in a good way. Ting Ting, as the newest editor on the panel here, might still be being surprised in a bad way at what people send into the journal, but we'd like to be surprised in a good way. So just because I don't have the imagination for what a replication of a case study might look like, hopefully somebody else does. And again, I think that the process allows for that, right? You think you have this really cool idea and you get to share it before you go off and spend a year collecting data, doing the analysis, and then having us go, oh, that's bizarre and not in a good way, right? Scott?
So something that makes me wonder, it seems like it was suggested earlier that we would not do a replication study of something that used secondary data, some government database or whatever. However, I've been a reviewer on papers where I look at the data and I think, they have the wrong model here. They have great data. And I think especially now that we're doing a lot of online appendices to articles where you can have the whole data set online, you throw it out there to the general population and they can look at it so I guess that's what I'm wondering is I had the impression earlier that we're saying we would not do a replication study of something involving secondary data or involving the data that was collected by the original authors. But I wonder if in terms of the way that we develop our statistical tests or whatever, that maybe that would be allowed. Any thoughts about that, about not collecting new data for a replication study? Is that a possibility?
I think the short answer is yes, but there'd have to be a good reason. I think that gets to, when you look at other components of open science, there is a hope, and certainly it's a direction that I think research in general is moving, where your data is publicly available and people have the opportunity to test it in different ways. And if it's really, truly just retesting your data, is that a replication is it a little research note? I'm sorry, I use the word little like it's a pejorative, but I can imagine there'd be reasons to do it, but I can also imagine a lot of cases where you would say, hey, somebody did this with secondary data from the US. I would like to do it with, I'm going to reuse the CompuStat data that they use, but I'm also going to use secondary data from some other part of the world, because I don't believe that the theory would generalize to say China or Europe or whatever. And so half of it may actually be just redoing what they did. I know that one of my colleagues here in finance, that's one of the first things they do to their PhD students. They give them an article, you know, it's all CompuStat data or whatever, and they go and try and reproduce these results. And then the student disappears for 3 months of pain because they have a huge amount of trouble figuring out, you know, what was done with missing data and all that other stuff to get to the same point. So I think the short answer is yes, secondary data is fine. Just reanalysis, there probably have to be a good rationale for why that was necessary, as opposed to just the reanalysis without something else added to it.
Like, for example, even just failing, as we talked about, failing to get results, meaning if you use the same data that the original authors used and you didn't get the same results, something's going on there. So that would then, and I really like this idea. I think Robert made the comment about explain, you know, can we then from that get some new theory that will help lead to, you know, further into the research stream? Thank you.
And I think we're all afraid that the explanation would be that we started playing with the data and we eventually got the same results as the original authors by dropping a bunch of quote unquote outliers and doing some other really dodgy things. And I think underlying the initial discussions about a lot of this stuff, especially the replication crisis in general, is the fear that a lot of the truth claims that we accept are based on research that might not have been done exactly as we'd like to be done. Now Eric's nodding his head yes. Suzanne, you had your hand up.
Yes, well, I actually finally took it down. And then as soon as I took it down, I realized I wanted to put it back up live with Zoom. So one fairly dangerous thought that comes to my mind is, so we tend to act like knowledge emerges and, you know, claims emerge kind of semi-magically from data. All that we need to do is like have the data and maybe clean it up a little bit, and then boom, there are our claims. But the fact is that we as researchers, a lot happens between the data and our brains on the way to making those claims. So Mikko Ketukivi and Saku Vantere wrote a forum piece on warrant that we are really emphasizing at JOM, that it's not just about data to claim, but what happens to the data on the way to the claim. And one of the reasons why replication is so important is that this processing through the brain that is required to translate the data into a claim is a fairly messy process. And the better that authors do with respect to warrant, the easier it is to replicate and understand and figure out what else happened and have our PhD students do stuff. So we're strongly encouraging authors to invest in describing that process, that it's not that it's wrong, it shouldn't have been necessary, it is always necessary. There's no such thing as a claim that magically appears from data.
Cool. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? If not, what I'll wrap up with is a reminder that, you know, we are planning to publish our editorial shortly. A few things to discuss with the other editors and editorial writers, but we'll be publishing it shortly. So if you do have feedback that you want to share in a more private version, that'd be great. We'd love to hear it, but hear it relatively soon. And then again, we have put together a bunch of other materials. I think one of the cooler things we did is we and this was collective, so Tom, Julia, Finn, and myself went out and interviewed a bunch of people. And really, we just said, what paper of yours would you like to see replicated? And I think some of those conversations were really cool. The papers they chose were really interesting in terms of, some of them were quite recent, some of them were much older, and the why and thought process behind it. And all that material will be easy to find on our website, and we'll make sure it's easy for people to get hold of. So with that, I thank you for your time on what, at least for me, is still a beautiful September day. And hopefully the next time we have a conversation, it's in person. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great session.
Bye.